Hey there, everyone. I wanted to go ahead and walk through chapter 2, your ethics and data collection, gathering data, as we're going to be talking about collecting data this week and the important parts of doing that. Because as special educators, we have a unique responsibility to adhere to ethical considerations when we're collecting data on students. And so the first part of our chat today is just talking about what the FBA process looks like regarding this. And then the second part is a little bit more about ethics. I've provided some extra resources just regarding FERPA and what that looks like. If you have any questions about ethical considerations with data collection, please don't hesitate to reach out after this week or even during your professional practice. So I just want to kind of start here. So we're starting with a case study with Ed. And so after you read that case study, I want you to consider these things. You can just take notes on these things. This is not something you have to submit to me, but I do want you to read through this case study and consider these from the reading. So what are his strengths and interests? What are his areas of need? What school, community, cultural factors might be impacting him? How does its behavior differ from typical development regarding those following aspects? Critique the supports that are in place for him. Okay, so I want you to provide a rationale for that as you're thinking through this. And then what are your initial thoughts about how might the existing supports be improved and what additional support should be added, and also provide a rationale. And then what questions do you have? So when we're looking through this case study, it's important to not skip these in the reading, because it is going to help you formulate ways to support students, especially when you're looking at the functional behavior assessment process and the behavior analysis process. And so whenever you're looking at these different case studies, whether it's this case study or something that's already happening in your classroom or something that may happen in the future, these questions are great questions just to kind of take a snip and hang on to those later on, because these are all great questions to ask whenever you're working with a student in this process, because we always want to make sure that we're considering these specific questions as we're going through the process. So looking at the FBA and BIP process, of course, we start with that functional behavior assessment. The student has a behavioral need. The behavior is impacting his learning or others, or her learning or that of others, and or their learning. We want to definitely identify the target behavior. Second, we want to convene the FBA team, which is that multidisciplinary team. So if you think back to SPED 704, where we talked about the multidisciplinary team and who's on that process, step 3 is collect the data. So looking at that again, just in a different format, so that you can kind of have an outline here. Looking at the FBA process, this table I snipped exactly from the reading. And so, it's from the Gilpin Zachnick OER, the Open Educational Resource that we're using. This is a good kind of process laid out where this is what we do. So we're taking identify the target behavior, we document the FBA, we use that description. Second piece, we're convening the IEP team, FBA. And so we've gone back to the IEP team and we say, hey, this is the data that we have. And we plan to talk about those initial thoughts about that target behavior. We plan the data collection. During the FBA, we're also collecting data. And so you're collecting data on the problem behavior, antecedents, consequences. If you think back to last week, we talked about setting events, direct, indirect resources, what is happening. And so those questions that I started with at the beginning, that's a great place to start. And then next, we'll talk about steps 4, 5, and 6 later on, but we're also in the next week, but we're also going to just address them today. Form hypothesis statements. So think back to that scientific method. Whenever we were in elementary school, we learned that hypothesis and the scientific method. We're using that same framework here. Develop function-based interventions and implement and monitor the BIP. So if we're looking at ethical considerations, this is primarily the most important piece that we have to consider whenever we're doing any type of data collection in special education, especially during functional behavior assessments. We're gathering assessment data, all formal and informal data. Educators, I'm going to move this around real quick. educators should explain the FBA process, including informed consent, confidentiality, and minimizing potential harm to the student. That should be explained to the family and to the student if the student is of a, you know, I usually think about like upper middle school, high school, ask the parents, ask the guardians if they want their student to be a part of that conversation. It's very important that the family and the students know informed consent to the FBA process. They give that consent. It can be revoked at any time, but informed consent is very important. So you're explaining exactly what you're doing. The data that will be obtained, collected, and any potential outcomes of interventions for the student. Very important part of informed consent. Your district probably has an informed consent form that the students need to sign. If they're old enough, the family and the guardian need to sign as part of this process. So this is not something you're doing solo. As an educator, you're a part of this team, this FBA team, this IEP team that's working with the other pieces, the other people in your school and in your district that are informing this behavior assessment. And so I would check with your district and see what informed consent form you would need to present to the families. Also, confidentiality is paramount. Nobody needs to know about this data, or nobody needs to know about the process that's happening in the first place unless they have a legitimate educational need for the student. So it's a required part of any ethical consideration. And you're going to show a form to the families and say, we promise to be confidential with all of this data, and they have to sign it. And know that data must be securely stored and disposed of when no longer needed. And so your district probably has a policy on that too. Sometimes it's 5 years, sometimes it's 7 years. And so you also need to explain potential harm. So educators must minimize potential harm to the student during the FBA process, especially during the period where you're collecting data and maybe observing, and then also doing the interventions. So that has to be an important consideration. You have to minimize potential harm to the student, whether it's emotional or physical harm. So again, your district school probably has forms that explain all of this, but this is very, very important. We don't go into anything with the FBA process, IEP process at all until we are evaluation process at all, until we've talked to the family and the guardians, parents of the student, so that we inform them well about what's going to happen. And remember, they can revoke consent at any time during this process. So educators must adhere to FERPA, and all data collection and any sharing with individuals who have a legitimate need to know the student's information must also adhere to FERPA. And so I put that link down here in case you need to have it, bookmark it if you want. Under certain circumstances, school professionals are required by law to conduct an FBA for students with disabilities who engage in challenging and disrupting behavior that interferes with their learning or the learning of others. And so just know that that is a process that your school psychologist might be able to give you more information about, like which students are required to have that. I worked in districts where the rules were different depending on the student's needs. And so just be aware and know who to ask. I've also put the resources for just the general IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, so you can have that there as well. So just taking a deeper dive as we finish. I did not put the links in this PowerPoint, but the links are in your open educational resource. Please definitely look at those because they take you to a set of Google documents that show a good data collection tools that have been developed: direct, indirect, early childhood. You could use a resource of all three of these if you want to, but please definitely take a look at those links that are in your OER. And let me know if you have any questions. We could have a really long conversation about ethical considerations when it's special education. And so you want to make sure that you are adhering to what is best for the student, and confidentiality paramount. Also, if you have access to a school district, you can chat with them just about what we're talking about in class 2 to see how they do that, because most school districts have a process of forms that parents need to sign before the educational evaluation process, any type of FBA process happens. So hope you all have a great week. I'm looking forward to learning with you and from you. And I hope if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.